Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world and when you're watching. My name is Austin Durant, and this is another episode of Fermentation Fact Friday. This is a new weekly series we've started to basically answer your burning fermentation-related questions. This week's episode is how important is salt in fermenting? So we'll cover all that. But first, some housekeeping. I want to remind you, we are Fermenters Club. Our mission is to improve people's lives by teaching them how and why to ferment food, as well as to create communities that are connected through our guts. And so we have many offerings. We've got a website chock full of recipes, tips, how to get started. We've got a global fermented food directory if you want to find a local company in your area to purchase from. We also offer a lot of educational courses, including Fermenters Club Academy, where you can learn at your own pace, as well as private team building workshops, whether that be sourdough bread, pickles, miso, kombucha, etc. They're fun ways to engage your team if you've got if you're looking for a good team building exercise. So lots of different options, lots of ways to learn from us. And of course, subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter and of course our YouTube channel. So all the ways that we like sharing the love of fermentation with you. And also I wrote a book a little over a year ago called Fearless Fermenting. It's a textbook meets cookbook, and it's all about food fermentation. It's got almost 80 recipes in there. You'll learn the basics of fermentation, the science behind it, etc., etc. So you can get a copy either from our website or on Amazon. All right, let's get to it. So what about salt? So salt, which is a compound, sodium chloride, made of sodium and a chlorine molecule, is a key ingredient for most bacterial ferments. Now, I think with the common misconception that I've heard is that salt is necessary for fermentation, which more or less is true. We'll get into that. But the reality is that it inhibits certain microbes. So if you think about the extreme of if we don't add any salt to something, we just put, let's say, cucumbers in fresh water and set it on a counter. In 2 weeks, what do you think might happen? It's going to be a soggy mess. Now, the other extreme of that might be something like we want to take a plank of salmon or fish and cure it with salt. So we envelop the whole thing in salt. That's the other extreme. What we're doing is we are creating an environment that no microbes can tolerate. So fermentation lies somewhere in the middle, and we'll talk about that. So it's important to know that salt acts as a microbial bouncer, I like to say. And that's because it regulates which microbes we allow to come to a specific ferment that we're doing. So through time-tested eons, we've learned what the right amounts of salt per weight of vegetable, or if we're making a brine, per weight of water, work well to do the fermentation, to allow the ones that we want to come in to the party and keep out the ones that we don't. So that's why I like to think of it as a bouncer. Another basic premise to understand about salt is that the more salt you add to a ferment, that's going to slow down the fermentation activity, and we can use that to our advantage. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what kind of salt should we be using when we ferment? In general, I would say the least processed salt you can, unprocessed, non-iodized, natural sea salt, all works great. These are some of the brands that I encountered and I like to use. Redmond real salt comes from an ancient seabed in Utah. Celtic sea salt comes from France. That third one's Himalayan salt, found everywhere. It's got a pink hue to it. I would just say I would avoid the sort of boxed or canned salt, which see all the extra ingredients: calcium silicate, dextrose, potassium iodide. You don't need the iodine for fermentation, and in fact, it might throw it off. If that's all you've got, it will probably still work. But again, the idea is let's keep the ferment as clean as possible in order to make sure we have the most success when fermenting. Next question, how much salt should we be using? So it depends on what we're actually fermenting. So pickled vegetables should be between about a 2 and a 5% salt, and that's the weight of the salt to the weight of the water. So when we're mixing a brine, Well, I'll show an example. We'll do the math, but basically anywhere between 2% of the weight of salt to the weight of water is the minimum, and about 5 is is my go-to actually. So, and again, the different levels of salt will change the activity and will change the nature of the ferment. So to create a more protective ferment, as I like to say, use more salt. And one example would be if we're making miso, which is a very long ferment. If we're starting the miso in the spring and planning to harvest it in the fall, that's only maybe a half a year, 6-7 month period. So we could use less salt. Whereas if we're starting something in the fall and we want it to last all the way to the next fall, that's a year or longer, you could add more salt. Again, that just adds a more protective effect of the ferment. So for vegetable ferments like pickles, kimchi, sauerkraut, as long as you're using at least a 2% brine, that's the bare minimum. If you go below 2%, you're going to risk letting those baddies, the bad guys in, and either making the texture bad, the flavor, or just it straight up getting moldy. And if you do fall outside of these safe boundaries, nature will let you know, right? Like I said, it'll get moldy, it'll be unappetizing in some other way. So examples of if you wanted to do a 2% brine, 3%, 4%, etc., you use this much fine sea salt. And we'll talk about fine just as the grade of it. For 2 cups of water, which would be a standard amount of water and brine that you would make in order to do 1 quart of pickles, for example. So here's our classic wide mouth pickle jar. It would be half the volume would be the vegetables and about half the volume would be the brine. So that's why 500 mils of water, or about a pint. So again, I like to go to 5%. That's sort of my easy no-brainer. It's easy math, and it works well for me. So one of the questions I get a lot is, can we ferment without salt? And again, the short answer is no. In styles that call for fermenting with salt, such as pickling, omitting salt will, like I said, result in a microbial free-for-all. And that just means everybody's coming in, that's molds, that's yeast, that's bacteria that may be bad for the ferment, and it's almost going to certainly become a moldy and or mushy mess. So I say for this style, because this doesn't apply to every, fermentation is a wide panoply of different ways to preserve food. So if we think of cultured-based ferments, whether that be kombucha or kefir, or if we're making tempeh, which is a fungus-based ferment, those have different ways of protecting the ferment. So they don't really use salt as to that purpose. So you don't want to say it's required for every ferment, but for the pickled ferments, if we're doing that style, we're using a brine, it is absolutely essential. One of the questions I often get is, what about, if I've got hypertension or I want to watch my salt intake? What I would say is ferment the thing that you're doing at the recommended amounts of salt, whether that's 2 to 5%. And then just before you're ready to consume it, you can lightly rinse whatever you're about to eat with fresh water. You'll still get most of the benefits. In fact, it's impossible to really wash off the probiotics because they're inside whatever the food source is. So just to get rid of some of the saltiness. Me personally, I actually use fermented vegetables in lieu of salt. So if I'm making a dish, whether that be a stir fry or a sandwich or something, I don't add salt when I'm making that dish. I know that, okay, I'm going to be adding something salty, i.e. sauerkraut or a pickle, to the thing. So I just don't even really use salt as much in cooking when I know I'm going to be adding a ferment. So that's something you can practice too. Another question I often get is, can I use whey instead of salt? Now whey, if you're making cheese yourself, is the liquid part of the process. We're straining out the milk and it coagulates, or the solids collect, and the whey is the liquid part and it drips through. And it is handy to use as in fermentation, because especially if we're using raw milk to make the cheese, or if we've cultured it, it's going to have some probiotic content, and therefore it makes it a good candidate for supplementing a ferment. But it does not serve the same function as salt. Remember, salt inhibits microbes. Whey would be a way to sort of inoculate or add microbes. So they're really not interchangeable in a recipe. Again, I like to think of whey as sort of the cherry on top. If you're starting a new ferment, it'll add a dose of probiotics, but it is absolutely not required for fermentation of those types of styles, whereas salt is required, as we've already explained. And this does not apply to, like, if you're used to getting whey as a dehydrated protein supplement, that's completely different than the whey we're talking about here. That whey has been highly processed, dehydrated. It probably has no probiotic value, so I wouldn't bother doing that. This is only if you've got the liquid, fresh stuff that you've harvested or created yourself as a byproduct of the cheese making process. So that's a whole other topic, though. All right, I think that covers everything about salt. If you've got any questions that I did not answer, please feel free to leave a comment down below and we'll get back to you. Just as a reminder, all of the resources are available to you at fermentersclub.com, here on the website, here on the YouTube. Go ahead and binge watch some of our videos and let us know if you have any questions. Until next time, I'm Austin Durant, and I will see you for the next Fermentation Fact Friday. Bye.